All right, I think we are ready. Good afternoon, everybody. How is everyone doing so far? Great. How many of you are doing Davos for the first time? Wonderful. Yeah, I'm a newbie, so it's exciting to be here with all of you. My name is Arnab Chakrabarty. I lead responsible AI for Accenture globally, and I'm excited to be with all of you here today. When we were, sort of planning for this session, we were not sure how many people we will get, and it looks good that the room is almost full. So thank you for making time and prioritizing it. I'm sure you have many other competing meetings, and you prioritize this topic, so really, really appreciate that. We have a great discussion lined up for all of us, and it's going to be a discussion. We're not going to be throwing things at you. But the topic is really, really very pertinent because we are talking about rebuilding trust this week, and responsible generative AI is at the heart of it, given how AI is becoming pervasive. So I have the privilege of getting some very distinguished colleagues and luminaries, if I can say, out here with us, we'll be delving into discussions. We're going to be doing a few things, but before that, let me do a quick introduction and ask my colleagues to introduce themselves, who they are, what they do. So we'll start with you, Andrew.
Hi, Andrew Levy. I'm the Chief Corporate and Government Affairs Officer for Accenture.
Hayat.
Hi, I'm Hayat Gallo. I'm responsible for all solution areas at Microsoft, so I get to work with our customers on all technology. And AI has kept us very busy in the last few months.
Sorry. And I'm Anna Makanju, and I lead the global affairs team at OpenAI. So it's engagement with policy makers and policy stakeholders all over the world. But also our team works on practical partnerships to make sure that our mission is real. So obviously there's been huge adoption in industry, but we want to make sure people who wouldn't otherwise benefit from the technology actually are able to do so.
I'm James Landay. I'm a computer science professor at Stanford, and I'm also the co-founder and vice director of our Institute for Human-Centered AI. And in my own research, I'm working on how to design AI to be more beneficial without some of the risks.
I'm Lan Guan. I'm Accenture's Chief AI Officer, and my responsibilities are working with cross-industry clients on a daily basis to help them adopt AI, build AI solutions, advance their AI journey.
Great. So I think the introduction hopefully gives you the sense of the background and the diversity that we bring here. And what we thought that when we talk about responsible generative AI, there are a few themes that are top of mind, and I'm sure you all have been having discussions. I think the first and foremost, people are all talking about different regulations, different standards, policies coming from the European Union Act to the White House Executive Order, the NIST standards. It's happening every day, and it's very hard to keep up. So we want to delve a little bit on that as to what's going on with the policy side. We also want to make sure that we are not being theoretical here. We want to talk about what are the practical approaches for operationalizing AI governance. We all hear the word AI governance, but how do you actually make it into practice? So we'll delve into that. We want to also make it a little geeky, not too geeky, but a little bit, so that we can talk about the technology, the generative AI technology, and how we embed responsible AI guardrails into that. And we have the privilege of having James with us, representing the academic world, and what's going on in the research world. We want to learn from that as the industry. So if that makes sense, and we'll have a dialogue with all of you. We have few comments from the colleagues here, and then we'll open it up for a good interaction. So with that, we'll go to you, Andrew. Maybe you give us a little update on what's going on in the policy world.
OK, thanks, Arnab. So I was given, I think, 5 minutes to talk about the state of AI policy globally. So we'll see how to do that. What I thought I might do, I'll try to give a brief overview of sort of where things stand, the trends that are emerging. I'll do a minute or two on the EU AI Act, both because we're here and for reasons I think it's particularly important for this discussion. And I'll touch on sort of where global governance is and where it may be going. But just to say, for someone in sort of the policy world, this is a super fascinating time, right? Because I can't remember any other occasion where you had policy being developed at the same time the tech was rapidly being developed and businesses are deploying and planning to deploy all at once. So I'm as closer to Arnab and the rest of our business and our clients than ever before because of that. And it's just critically important that we as the world and countries get this right. The resolution of balancing of risks and opportunities and a whole host of open questions. And it's really important that who's involved is correct as well. And we'll touch on that, I think, when you get to global governance, that you have the right stakeholders at the table in terms of government, industry, academia, civil society, but also a diversity of countries, so views are represented, which is not an easy task, but I think it's really important. So turning to kind of where things are, I'm sure people are aware there's a ton of activity all over the world. Almost every country is either proposing laws, regulations, policy, frameworks, et cetera. Every day it feels like something new is happening. And so while the journey is very much still ongoing for most countries, if not all, there are some trends and sort of categories that are emerging. Can't hear me? Okay. Categories that are emerging that we can touch on. And really it's about the spectrum between voluntary compliance and standards and mandatory regulatory requirements. And the way I think about it, and you can break it down, there's sort of risk-based approaches, there's more rule-based, and then sort of principle or outcome-based. The risk-based, the best example is the EU AI Act, which we'll talk about a little more in a second. Rule-based is more targeting, rather than a comprehensive framework, trying to target specific use cases or specific issues and make rules around those. China is probably the best example there. And then when it comes to principles and outcomes, that's where a lot of the world is right now. The US is probably the best example, which I can touch on. But you see it, countries like Singapore, Japan, UAE and Saudi in the Middle East are pushing more towards kind of an innovation-first standards, but not mandatory requirements, trying to keep things flexible and lean on or encourage voluntary compliance. The U.S., as people probably heard, there was the executive order that the White House put out, I think a couple months ago now. Most of it is in this voluntary compliance effort. A number of agencies have to come up with standards about how they think are the best practices for governing AI in different sectors based on the agency's sort of jurisdiction. But there is an aspect that is not voluntary for certain models that they've categorized as sort of high risk, systemic risk, et cetera. So the U.S. definitely from a philosophical perspective is still pushing voluntary and flexible approach. At the same time, they've recognized some areas that they want to be more prescriptive. And so you call it a hybrid, which I think is what we'll see over time a lot of countries doing. It won't be all one or the other, despite my attempt to categorize them. Let me talk about the EU AI Act. So it's not just because we're sitting in Europe, but it is, first of all, after the political agreements that happened this past December, the act still has to be finalized, but there's a little more of a framework to it. And once it's resolved, it'll be the first comprehensive legislative framework out there. And because it applies to all AI deployed or developed in the EU, for any international companies, it's set to become the sort of de facto standard, the benchmark standard. So as we talk to clients and companies, it's really important that they start to understand what this regulatory regime could look like. So at a very high level, the Act, this is one of the, as I said, risk-based is how it's described. There are 4 categories that they try to put different use cases into, from unacceptable risk at the high level to minimal or no risk at the bottom. And the greater the risk, the greater the regulatory requirements. The one I'll focus on, because I think it's most important for I think most companies, is the high-risk category. So things are not banned, but there are a number of requirements that attach to use cases that are deemed high risk for deployers and for developers. And high risk is defined as use cases that have safety components to products or uses that are perceived to implicate fundamental rights. And those really cross all industries, which is all I'll say is that's credit scoring for banks, it's eligibility requirements for insurance companies, medical devices, oil and gas safety products, HR decisions companies may make. If AI is used in those areas, they'll likely be in this high-risk category, which has a number of compliance requirements that attach to it. I know I'm probably almost at 5, so just very quickly on global governance, because I know it's a big focus of WEF, as it should be. To date, there's no single organization that has sort of primacy in this space. There's a lot of effort. You've seen it from the G7 with what was called the Hiroshima process, the G20, the UN has launched an AI focused working group, and they're all doing good work, but none of them sort of, I think, has all the components that we really need to have an effective global governance. And what I mean is you need the ability to convene, as I said at the beginning, governments, academics, civil society, and industry. And you need to be able to do it with more than 7 countries or 20 countries. So having inclusion from the Global South, for example, is going to be critical to have a sustainable framework that, that makes sense for everyone and that reflects all the implications that are out there. Just making sure. I guess I'll leave it there because that's probably about 5. Awesome. So I'll turn it to you, Arnav.
Thank you.
Quick run around.
Thank you, Andrew. It's always great to have Andrew next to me because as I'm kind of working in Accenture, making sure everything we do in a responsible manner, having your friend next to you on the policy and the government affairs is always a good thing to do. So thanks, Andrew, for all your insights. What I wanted to do before we delve into the panel, I wanted to share a few insights, that we have from Accenture, working with a number of our clients globally. So we have done, just for all of you to know, we have worked on 700 projects with our clients over the last 12 months. And the interesting thing is 2023 was all about experimentation. People wanted to try out, people were learning from it. And what we found were there were certain industries that took a lead, whether it's banking, whether it is the software and platforms, the big tech, whether it's the insurance clients, the health, life sciences, consumer goods. I think this is where we saw the momentum. And as we started 2024, we are seeing that these organizations that have done the experimentation, done the pilots, they are in that moment of taking the jump to saying, I now need to start scaling that. And the biggest question that we are getting every conversation is, there are so many risks that are there. When I did the pilot, it was fine, but now that when I'm getting into scale production, there are various risks. And the issue is generative AI is very different. It is not the traditional machine learning that we knew, where the data is constantly changing here. We have got prompt injections going on. The models are changing. And how do we make sure we are on top of that, to make sure the bias is not coming into it? We have issues like misinformation, disinformation that can happen so easily. What are the right guardrails that we can put to maintain, manage the hallucination issues? Because these are all trust breakers. And once you have that, it is very difficult to bring it back. So we are kind of dealing with that. And as we are working with a number of companies across the globe, we had an opportunity of doing a research with about 1,000+ CEOs over the last 12 months to see what's their sense, of when we are talking about being responsible in approaching generative AI, what's coming in their way. And it was interesting. We saw 96% of the companies were stating that they are following the regulations and standards and respecting that in some shape and form, okay? However, when we ask the question that how many of you have actually implemented AI governance and responsible AI across the organization in a fully operational manner, the response rate went down from 96% to 2%. And that's what we call as the gap. And that's going to be a big part of our discussion today. How to increase that from 2% to at least in the next 12 months, 30%, because that will start creating much more confidence and adoption and the value acceleration from generative AI. And there are few questions that needs to be asked for doing that. And these are based on our own experience as Accenture, running our own AI governance compliance program for Accenture. 5 questions, and we'll delve into that from the panel here, is what is it that we need to do in terms of our principles? Do we have our principles and guidelines and policies and standard for our own company with respect to AI? If we have that, that's only the first step. I think the majority of the businesses and industries that I speak with, they are on that first step. But the second piece is tying back to what you mentioned, Andrew. Do you have a risk assessment approach established for all the AI that you are developing and designing and deploying within your company? Do you have an ongoing mechanism to test the AI solutions? Because this is not a one-time thing done. You have to continuously test your AI solutions so that you have to make sure bias has not crept into the solution. That was maybe fine 2 months back, but suddenly something has changed. Do you have a way to monitor that on an ongoing basis? And the more important thing is responsible AI is not about just the technology that we are talking about. It's actually about the human aspect. Have we taken care of the human impact, the workforce impact? Have we taken care of cybersecurity? Whenever we are going into the discussion, the topic of cybersecurity comes very closely with AI governance. Have we assessed for that? Have we taken care of sustainability? I don't know how many of you are thinking about sustainability when you think about deploying AI, but this is going to be very important as we think about the carbon emissions. Large language models are heavily carbon intensive, and how are we taking care of the optimization of the carbon, optimization of the energy consumption, so on and so forth. So just wanted to share some of that as just some insights that we are getting. And this is a journey, and I'm sure you have many insights, and we will hear from you shortly. So if that's okay, I would love to jump into our panel and turn to you, Hayat. You've been at Microsoft and you've been driving a number of initiatives at Microsoft, and you're telling me about your past background in security, so that's phenomenal. Tell us a little bit about the whole responsible AI program, how to make it operational. What have you done at Microsoft? What can we learn from you?
Yeah, so I think we started on that journey in 2017. At the time, I was in engineering, actually. We started with principles first, but we learned very quickly that principle was not sufficient, because as a developer, I remember receiving the principle from our policy team and sitting there and saying, okay, what am I supposed to do with this? Like, I'm developing a product, right? So then we realized we really need to get very concrete for all function as to what does that mean in your day-to-day. So the first thing is we took our principle and we turned that into standards. And what that means is, under each principle, we have a context and goals, and then we have specific actions that we need each group to take, whether it's design, engineering, policy, sales, and we're very specific for each goals. So that gave a playbook to the teams to say, okay, how do we go about this? The second thing is we had to think about our development cycles. And for us, it was really important that you don't wait until the end, because it's very costly to get to the end of your design and find out that you're not compliant with what we aspire to. So we completely changed our development cycles, and we created milestones. And in the process, we now have policy and design with engineering right from the start. And then what we said is, first is we're going to give tools then to people to be able to actually operationalize this responsible AI through that cycle. So step one was we gave them assessments templates. Any teams that is going to go build an AI system has to assess the risk that the solution is building and the potential positive, but also negative impact, and make sure they think through how they mitigate that. Then as they move to the next stage, we said, okay, let's make sure that the design is also centered around the humans. So we created a tool called Hacks that we give to our designers to make sure we're asking all the right questions for the AI systems we build. The next thing we introduced was a set of an AI dashboard, our AI dashboard, and a tool set. And what it does is, if you're a developer and you're building your models, then you have to test your model and say, is this delivering against the behavior I wanted? And if you find that it's not, then this tool is allowing you to go and debug and try to see, okay, what is happening? Why I'm expecting X and I'm getting Z? And so it helps you debug that. So that's the piece around the development. And then when you're deploying, we're putting tools in our Azure systems to make sure that customers can make sure there is safety, and we have guardrails and actually content safety tools to make sure that it helps. So that's the first piece that we did. And then the second piece is we said we need champions. So in each function, we put champions. So SMEs in each group. And then the second thing is we created a console. So we literally have senior executive in the company that meet every month, that review all the projects, they look at them, and anything that we're not sure about gets escalated and they weigh in as the SMEs are working through it. And then we have training. Every function in the company has been trained from an RAI perspective, all the way to salespeople, because from engineering to designers to developers to sellers, to make sure that when we work with customers, we can help and guide. And then we've made sure everything that we have is open source, so that our customers, our partners, we want everybody to leverage that, and we want to learn. We want people to give us feedback so we can get better. So that's how we went from principle to trying to get a little bit more concrete on our day-to-day and how we operationalize our AI at Microsoft.
No, that's really interesting. I think you almost laid out the playbook here, in terms of what can be done. I mean, you said you started the journey in 2017. We are in 2024. Let's assume a scenario where companies are starting now, to do that. What would be your suggestion based on the journey that you went in? If you have to do it now, and you have to start, and if you had all the knowledge and the insights, what would you do?
Everything I've said, we have a playbook, and it's open source. So I would say first, take a look, and say, okay, how are we doing it in our own company, right? Do we have principles? I have customers who don't have principles. I'm like, that's step 0, right? 2 is, how do you help people get real? So we open source our tools. You can use them, you can decide not to use them, but you gotta have tools through that life cycle. You gotta have a governance. You gotta have that I ask customers, how are you going to govern all those projects? You got to have governance on this. And then, of course, you have to train people. You can't assume that from day 1 to day 2, suddenly people understand the implications of what they're building, the risk they're taking, the impact you can have on the brand if you launch something really, really bad in the market. So I also say to customers, start internally. It's less risky for your brand. Pick a project internal and try to run it end to end. And then apply that, and then see where it's breaking in your system, where you don't have the resources, where people are not getting on board with it, and where the tools are not helping you. What tools are you missing? I find that taking one project and really taking and running it and getting to production, to your point, it's one thing to have an MVP, it's another thing to get to production. And our AI gets very much tested when you get to the production layer and really thinking now about all the impact you can have. So I would say that's what I would recommend.
That's great.
Take playbooks from us. I'm sure you guys are going to have playbooks. I'm sure you have playbooks. So how does it work in our company, and what do we want to do? But you got to have a point of view is always what I say. And start internal first, make it work, and then you can go and say, how am I going to serve my customers and like streamline my operations? But I think you got to learn.
That's great. No, this is very practical, and I think a point that you brought about, this is something we don't have to do in isolation. Mm-hmm. We don't have to just leave it to us to figure out everything. You know, this is a collaboration, team play, you know, across the boundaries of our organization, and that's where I'm going to go to you. And next, I mean, one of the things I hear a lot is and Andrew, you brought up as well, the policies are changing, evolving. There is so much. Like I remember, I had a meeting with one of the oil and gas major, you know, senior leader. And I was hearing that, how do we keep up with everything that's going on? It can be a full-time job. And you know, given what OpenAI is doing and your mission, this is so important. How do you do that in your role, first of all, you know, to be on top of all the policy changes, and then not just understanding that, but then converting that into what OpenAI the company is doing, how you're bringing up new products and solutions. How do you translate that? Could you give us some insights on it?
If you're asking me how I do it, I think the answer is poorly. Because you know, Andrew did a very good job laying out a bunch of the key regulatory frameworks, but there's also, for example, ISO, which is working on standards. There are you know, the OECD has principles, UNESCO has principles. There are a number of civil society, academic, industry organizations that have, you know, frameworks. And because we really don't have a sense right now which framework is actually the framework that the industry is going to adhere to. And then, of course, you know, our own research, because we work on all of this, and we believe that we are industry leading in terms of a lot of safety practices, research practices. And we actually have an industry coalition that works on safety best practices. So I'm hearing from my colleagues at much larger companies that this is quite overwhelming to them. And so this is quite overwhelming to us as well. But the nice thing about OpenAI is that our company was founded on the understanding that our mission is to make sure these tools are built safely. So for a lot of the frameworks, we essentially already are doing all of the work that is necessary to comply with them. You know, voluntary commitments that we made to the White House are probably the most operationalized framework right now. We, of course, you know, implement that. We have a team that ensures that it's implemented across all of our new releases, et cetera. But it's a huge challenge.
So I fully get the challenge, and I'm sure everybody is like, what is that one thing that we should be doing that you are doing? You know, so is there like a suggestion, you know, just to be on top of all the regulations? Is there a best practice that you have found that helps you to be on top of it, and more importantly, not just react to it, but being proactive, you know, around this policy evolution? You
know, I mean, have an amazing team. So that's kind of the secret, because they really help us understand and track, and you know, I think that this has always been a challenge for policy teams, but I can't say that there's like truly a best practice here. And I've spent a lot of time at Davos talking to a lot of my policy colleagues. I'm not sure anyone really has a playbook for this.
That's really an opportunity for this group to actually evolve that, yeah?
If I may say, though, I think one of the things that, because we work closely with policy in our group as well, one of the things that they're really pushing with us, in absence of regulations, right? The only thing you can do is say, how do I have scrutiny on high-risk scenarios and human rights, making sure that the safety, whether it's physical or whether it's psychological or your ability to have, opportunity in the world and your legal rights and all that stuff. So we have kind of provided a framework that says, be responsible in the sense of there's no regulation on those things, but not every scenario is equal, right? If you're building a predictive maintenance system, make sure that you're really scrutinizing this model and the results you get, because if you get it wrong, you may kill people. Or if you're building an admission tool for a university, if you're not careful, you could put bias in there and then prevent some kids from getting opportunities, right? So I think on AI as well, we need to think about what are the high-risk scenarios versus lower risk, right? There are things like that are lower risk where you need to be maybe less paranoid, and there are things that impact those factors that I think as a company, in absence of regulation, you just have to test the outcome, right, and see what's the impact.
But I think that these are two things that, we have a mission and charter, and we have 3 separate teams. One that works on safety of current systems, one that is very thinking in great detail about the safety of systems that are going to be out there, and then one thinks about, perhaps theoretical superintelligence systems, but we're still doing an incredible amount of research to understand what would be necessary to align those to human intention. So this is, and we have a mission and charter that guides everything that we do. So I agree that there's, you have to do that work up front. You can't wait for regulation.
Yeah,
but
I love that.
The current regulatory space is very fragmented and complex.
No, I think this is a perfect segue. You use the word, the research that you are doing, to be proactive. And this is a great segue to James yourself. Like, tell us what's going on in the research world, given your role in Stanford, but in a broader research world in the area of AI safety, AI governance, that we can all benefit from in the industry.
Yeah, so I think a really important thing for people in the industry to understand is, what are the actual risks and where should they be focused? You'll hear a lot of stuff in the press of, is AI going to take over the world and, launch nuclear weapons? This is science fiction, and you should get it out of your head. It's a waste of your time, and it's a distraction from the real problems. I like to say the 3 Ds of AI that are there right now. No matter what, if we make the models no better than they are today, we already have disinformation. We saw what disinformation can do in the 2016 and other elections. We have to deal with that. We have deep fakes. This is going to be the year of deep fakes. You don't want someone calling your mom that sounds just like you and saying, hey, you need to send this money to me, or worse, attacking young girls in high school with fake pornography. And then finally, we really need to look at discrimination bias. So these 3 Ds are things that are potential in systems. They're not inherent, they don't have to be, but we have to be careful, and this means you have to have processes like were outlined at Microsoft. But we have to think about how to develop AI systems in a new way, because it's not the same as your previous software. We want to do user-centered design, which now industry after 30 years has finally gotten a hold of. We appreciate it after all that research. But AI systems have impact beyond the direct user. They have impact on broader communities, whether it's people labeling data or whether it's communities that are impacted by decisions that are made by these systems. So when we're doing human-centered AI, we also have to do community-centered design and bring that voice in. And then finally, if your AI system is so successful that it becomes ubiquitous across society, there are societal impacts. For example, we saw the Compass system in terms of deciding on parole and terms. That can have societal impact, which means we have to have societal analysis also in our design process. So if you hear that and you go, damn, that sounds really hard, it is hard. It's especially hard for technologists, computer scientists who are not trained to do these analyses. So you have to have interdisciplinary teams with designers, social scientists, and domain experts, and they have to be there on the start. Some companies have decided we can just treat AI like we did security and privacy and have a check process at the end. It's been shown to be a failure because by then there's not enough influence to stop some of these products from going out, and that will lead to some of these reputational harms. So we need a new kind of way of thinking about design. That's one thing we're developing, is what would that process look like? And we're working with a lot of our corporate partners to kind of try those things out.
No, that's fantastic. I think you brought about the 3 Ds. I think that is really, really important. And you talked about how we need to create these methods and tools to address that. And this is probably a great segue, Lan, to yourself as Accenture's Chief AI Officer. How is the technology evolving, and how we can actually bring the 3Ds that James just talked about into actual solution integrated part of our generative AI implementations.
Sure, yeah. So I will address this question from the technology angle. And by the way, this is a question that many clients ask me because we talk all day long about principle, right? The guidelines, they're asking me the question, okay, instead of being spooked, right, can you bring a solution? And can you be more practical and tell me how I should be solving these problems? Because the bias risk will never go away, but they want to mitigate that. They want to reduce the risk. So that's why Arnav and I came together. Two of us worked together probably for longer, a decade now, right? And we basically said, okay, how do we bring Accenture's expertise, into this space? We're very lucky. We got $3 billion investment from our firm. Of course, a large portion of this is going to be focusing on building this kind of repeatable solutions for cross-industry clients. So how do we do that? First of all, I completely agree with Microsoft Teams' approach, addressing the full model lifecycle kind of approach. I think I will actually dimensionalize this a little bit differently, right? Think about this as a layer cake, okay, of the architecture, because you really need to understand, this whole Gen AI lifecycle and the different building blocks within this ecosystem, and also understand the weaknesses around each layer. If you do that, then you build a solution to address each of them. I think that's a very effective way. That's our strategy. So if you look at the data layer, right, as many of us know, foundation model, large language model is full of broad scale data. But again, even if you look into the type of data being used by model, they're also very heterogeneous, right? Wikipedia data is actually only less than 5% of the most models in the market. Books data, right, takes up a lot of a percentage, a larger portion. And this kind of data is full of misinformation, right? And also just because of vast volume of the data, making this kind of risk even more prominent. And of course, internet data, right? There's a lot of user styles that, when they write this kind of, data, create this kind of data, is creating inherent bias. So again, the point here is when you build a technology solution, you need to understand all this shortcomings in your underlying data so that you can implement data quality, data profiling, right, deduping kind of solutions, right, programmatically, so that this kind of data during the training process can be addressed. And it's not just training, right? Also, most of my cross-industry clients are using this kind of foundation model from prompt engineering, angle. So in this case, also, we ask them to basically pay attention to the quality of their internal data. Let me give you one example. Telco clients I work with, they told us they actually have 37 versions of a standard operating procedure in contact center. I'm like, okay, that's supposed to be one single source of a truth. How can you have 37 versions? So imagine if they just, bring all this data without filtering, without treatments into the prompt engineering stage, you are introducing many newer layers of risk. And I think on the model layer, right? Let me just keep it brief, right? We all know the transformer architecture powering all this large language model is fundamentally different from other neural network, deep learning kind of architecture. In this case, essentially it creates many dimensions. This is a course that James and his colleague taught, at Stanford, right? So once you actually have this kind of high dimensional space of the model architecture, again, you inherently introduce data sparsity problem, which means for any malicious actors, it's very easy for them to just insert one, malicious data that could create data poisoning attack. So something like that, it's not very intuitive, but now we are building solutions, right, to address that. And we're also working with a lot of clients to say, okay, now you can actually fine-tune your own model. You can actually open the different layers of a model and address some of this inherent risk. You can also do the alignment tuning, right, to, again, make sure the underlying model is more aligned to your, company's, brand styles or your core value. use. And I think application layer, if I go up there, right, is also full of risk. And I think the power of a model in this case could also become something hurting you. This is a syndrome that what we call this syndrome actually unrestricted agency, because model is so powerful. It could introduce a lot of autonomous actions on the application layer that you may not want. Okay, so that's why in this case we're building LLM ops kind of a solution to address this kind of risk. And I think the infrastructure layer, right? That's another one that, again, oftentimes we forget about that. And again, if you understand how this technology works, essentially you're doing distributed learning across hundreds of GPUs. In the past, if this kind of learning is done on single GPU or TPU or even CPU, then your risk exposure is less. In this case, again, you're widening the interface of your risk exposure. So again, hardware security, privacy preservation kind of algorithms implemented on the hardware level. All these are the examples that we are actually baking into our solution. So in a nutshell, this is how I will break down my playbook. We're already building a lot of these building blocks. We're actually branding that as the AI Navigator. We're very eager to take this, to work with our partners, right, to also take this to many clients. So responsible data, responsible model, responsible application, responsible infrastructure. I think this is our formula to address responsible AI from the technology standpoint.
Well, thank you, Lan. That was a great perspective. And what I love is you're bringing a very systemic approach for making responsible AI operational. And I think a good way to bring it to life could be an example. And I'm going to turn to my friend from Microsoft. Hayat, you talked about tools, that you have been building up for all the AI products. Could you maybe take an example and just bring it to life as your teams are bringing the new AI solutions powered with generative AI into the market? What kind of tooling is being used from a responsible AI testing perspective, monitoring perspective? And you said some of that is open source. So maybe if you can share some examples that this team can benefit from, will be phenomenal.
Yeah, I think I talked earlier about it, but I think one that is quite interesting, and I think our developer from the start were like, if you want us to operationalize the principle, it has to be concrete for us, right? And so when you design an AI system and you have a certain intent, you need to be able to test and say, okay, am I seeing the behavior that I wanted to see? And very quickly, our developer says, you got to give us tools. So we created tools to kind of mimic and at scale, right, what it looks like, the responses we're getting, and then give you the ability to then go debug, to say, okay, what's the root cause? Why is my model behaving in a certain way or the outcome in a certain way? My system is giving an answer that I don't expect. So we gave them debugging capabilities so they can go really down by layer until we can fix it and get the root cause of that, right? If you're in Azure AI and you're developing an application, we have AI content safety that is embedded in our Azure AI Studio, which is where you have MLOps and DevOps coming together. And we're making sure, for example, you have content safety. So as you're using and deploying, we're making sure that harmful content, we have a moderation system, we block things. And then as you're building your applications, we give you as well testing capabilities so that you yourself as a customer can assess and benchmark and see what results you're getting, and is this meeting the intention? So we've embedded all this in this studio so that our customers they don't have to think differently. As they're building it, they can test real time.
Fantastic, fantastic. No, this is great. I think we talked, this was the geeky part that I was referring to. Hopefully you found it interesting. I think the piece that is becoming very clear, as all of you are speaking, and Andrew, you talked about it also in your topic, was the collaboration aspect. The collaboration between the business, academia, policymakers, and also the global coordination. Mm-hmm. So maybe I'll go to you, James, because you sit in a very interesting position. You work with a number of corporates. You work with government agencies. What is needed, and in your mind, what are the gaps today, with respect to the global coordination on the topic of AI governance, and what are few actions we, as the leadership and the members of the business and society need to take? What is your point of view on that?
Yeah, well, so one part of us founding the Institute over 5 years ago was in anticipation of these technological breakthroughs of things like OpenAI has done. Maybe a little faster than we were planning for it to occur, and maybe faster than they were planning. But it was the idea that these things were going to affect all of society and upend everyone's roles, our jobs, our education, et cetera. And so we need to get ahead of it and bring together a lot of people to talk about it and to try to come up with policy and to do it in more of a neutral framework. So we feel the university, we don't really have skin in the game in terms of, hey, we're going to make billions of dollars on this. Instead, it can be a neutral ground where even competitors can come and talk about these things in a way that they sometimes can't. I think one problem right now is there's so many now different AI groups, and it can be really hard to navigate. Like, which one should I be a member of, and what are they doing? So that's a little confusing. And we could probably try to figure some way to unify some of this a little bit. I think might help people. Another one I think is there really is an issue in terms of resources that are now occurring. So a lot of this technology that is happening in all these places originated in academia. Many of the basic ideas, even the Transformer paper, was built on ideas in academia. But at this point, the amount of computation required to do many of these things is now becoming beyond academia. And if we want to make sure that this technology is not just in a few powerful hands, we need to make sure that those resources are available. So in the United States, there's actually a bill in Congress to create a national research infrastructure for academia to be able to work in AI. There's places like Stanford where we have the benefit of being very close to a lot of companies and starting a lot of these companies. And so it's an issue for us, but maybe not as bad as some other places. And a lot of universities are building their own large clouds, but nothing of the size that OpenAI or Microsoft can bring. So those are some of the issues: is how do we keep academia engaged? Because if we're not able to work on these problems, they're not going to have employees who know how to work on this when they're trying to hire, because they won't be exposed in the universities, and they won't be exposed to the risks and all the other things if we can't really build the whole thing. So from our perspective, that's like one of the biggest problems right now. And we've been lucky at Stanford in that our institute works very closely with many industry players. Accenture, is a member of our industrial partnerships, and so other folks who want to join that, we welcome you. But that's a way for us to make sure we're connected to the problems that people are actually facing, but also then to take our expertise and help industry learn from a lot of experts, not just on the technology side, we have that, but also on the social impact, on the economics, on the law, on medicine, which you won't see that kind of expertise in most of the companies. So that's another place that universities, I think, need to play in this.
Great. I think this is fantastic. I really want to really engage all of you and open up. But before I do that, Andrew, did you have any other observations before we jump in?
Sure. Am I on? It's been great to listen to this. Just a few quick things. So I was rushing before and didn't say, but I think it came out in the conversation why this global governance is important. I think we touched on it all. It's the idea of interoperability, which may come from standards, may come from these organizations, is helpful, at a compliance level. But I think you were touching on some of the deeper societal reasons too, and it goes to the inclusion point as well. I mean, because of the talent gap around the world, the compute power gap, et cetera, like if we don't have some oversight at the global level, the potential for this to evolve in a way that exacerbates geopolitical tensions, et cetera, is a real thing. And just the idea of how you stay on top of regulation, I would argue, even though it's my job too to sort of do it, if for those who are not, unless you're in a particular country and you have to, I would argue right now you don't even have to try. I think what I mean is like, what I mean is,
I think Anna was clear.
I think what the U.S. is doing, which I said sort of a hybrid thing, what Europe is doing, the EU is doing, that is sort of the paradigm or the philosophical sort of debate between mandatory and less so. So I mean that's where I think the action is and how that will evolve over time, because it is hard. And I think sifting through, this is something that we have to do in our job too. All the organizations, as you said, if you go down the promenade, I think AI is everywhere. I think I saw a sign that said AI is everywhere. So like everyone's attaching it to everything they do, and you really kind of have to sift through what's substantive, what's not, et cetera. Last thing I'll say, part of the reason I wanted to spotlight the EU AI Act is it put aside the debate about whether the approach is the right one from a regulatory standpoint. it's super helpful to have a framework that even now companies can and should be looking at. So you mentioned like high risk and making sure you're thinking about it. Well, the act is pretty good, and a lot of thought went into like what would those compliance requirements be. So practically for companies, you should probably start thinking about it. But it's also just a way to think of your own program, as we did as well, because you have, right there's a lot of thought in a cohesive way.
Oh, that's great. So I think we want to make it interactive now, and I want to learn from the team here. Who amongst you is actually driving a responsible AI governance program inside your company? It'll be great actually if you are, if you can share what you're doing and what you're learning from that, and any best practices.
Sure. Okay, I'll start. I'm Linda Leopold from H&M, global fashion retailer. I've been leading our work on responsible AI since 2018, actually. So we were pretty early for being a non-tech company. And our setup is pretty similar to Microsoft's. We have principles. We have a digital ethics policy that is applicable across to all employees globally. We also have been breaking down our principles into more tangible guidelines and so on. And we have an ethics committee. But I think that the biggest difference now with generative AI, if you're a non-tech company, is that it suddenly applies to everyone. So previously our stakeholders were maybe a few hundred people working with AI across the company. And now suddenly it's 155,000 employees. So that's the big difference. And if we are not building AI solutions, we do that to some degree, but the big chunk of AI applications now is general productivity tools, so AI features being integrated into tools that we are already using, or third-party solutions. So here, the big challenge is to talk to all these 100,000 people who often don't have a tech background or a tech understanding. So our focus now my focus is on culture and communication. That's really the most important thing, I would say.
It's such a great point.
Yeah.
One of the things I would add to what you said, which we're seeing with customers, Microsoft, we're an engineering company, to your point, we're a tech company. So for us, it's very structured, who develops products, who does what. But what we've seen is, as customers, you talked about experimentation. A lot of customers are asking, do I start with mushroom projects everywhere in my company? Do I put governance even on what tech sandboxes? How do I control what project? Not only because of the profitability, is that the right scenario, but they're like, I don't know what's going on in my company, right? And so one of the things is your point around everybody gets to use it, but many people are actually playing with it. And a lot, as part of the governance and responsible AI, is also knowing what's happening in your company. If you're not careful, suddenly people are using all kinds of tools. There's mushrooms everywhere, and then you're like, I have no idea that's happening. That's a key piece of responsible AI, because you can go with the principle we just discussed, but if you don't know what's happening, and I find this is one of the biggest pieces right now we're finding, because we're tech and we know who gets to develop anything in our company, and it's coded and we're very clear. It's not as obvious in non-tech companies, so that's something to really think about. And how are you going to govern that? Who gets to play with this and build stuff on your behalf? It's a very important question to tackle, I think.
I think two great points. One about the role of communication, and I think I will connect the role of training and enablement that goes with communication is very, very important. Like at Accenture, we have 750,000 employees. We have rolled out responsible AI and Gen AI curriculum for all of our employees. That is done by our CEO right to the analyst. And for our 40,000 data and AI practitioners that works with Lan and myself, it is mandatory for them to take an ethics and compliance program on responsible AI. And if they don't take that, it has an impact on their annual performance, right? So that's the way we think about why this is so important, because this is connected with the trust and the reputation of the company.
Yeah. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
This is actually going to take us on a slight tangent, but I'm realizing I've wanted to ask this question, and since we have the benefit of your wisdom. Now, OpenAI does not our tools are not going to be used for something like Compass, obviously. That's not allowed by our use case policy, but this is actually more of a personal question. I have a sister who spent a lot of her life in the criminal justice system. And I'm a lawyer, so I've seen all these studies where, like, if a judge has, if the local baseball team has lost, they're less likely to grant parole. If they granted it 3 times, they're less likely to grant parole.
After lunch, before lunch.
Right. So I'm really curious about how the research community thinks. Like, even though with Compass, there's obviously some bias that was ingrained in the system, but do researchers compare that to the terrible outcomes, special communities of color have otherwise? At least you're taking some arbitrariness, in addition to human bias, out of the decision making?
Yeah, so the social scientists who work on these questions know of those issues, and there is comparison. So some people feel like, oh yeah, if it's a computer, that means this might be more fair than the arbitrary biases of, let's say, the judge or whoever. But we have to look at, those computer systems, what's the data that they're trained on, and they tend to be trained on the historical data that was already biased. Right. So, if we are going to use those systems, we still have to figure out a way to remove that bias and to get to a better place. I think the real issue is a tendency of technologists to really have this replacement paradigm in their head. Like, people who are trained in AI really learn, I find out what a worker does, I get a data set from them, and then I build a model to do the same thing. And that's a replacement mindset. Instead, we really need to go back to, really the 60s when AI was being developed, but at the same time, Doug Engelbart at the Stanford Research Institute was developing this idea of intelligence augmentation. His group is actually what invented the user interface that you all use in your computers today, was invented by Engelbart. And AI is going to empower augmentation of human intellect. And so we need to think about, how do we design AI systems to augment people? So instead of replacing the judge's decision, we need an AI system that's going to help him or her, but it has been designed with these questions in mind, so as to look for those biases and expose it so we don't have those problems. But some of them are so systemic in the data that it requires a lot more work than just taking a training set and building a model.
I think I'm super interested in the outcome measurement.
Great. So let's open up for questions, from the audience and to the panel. What are top of mind questions or comments based on what you heard?
Hi, my name is Chris Overman. I'm at Meta, the head of our global governance engagements and partnerships. And we actually, partnering with Stanford and BIT, and we did one of the largest ever deliberative democracies, what we call our community forums. And you talked about user-centered approaches in this. I just would love to hear from each of you, OpenAI and Microsoft and others and et cetera, how you guys are thinking about the user-centered approach, because we're all large firms. We all have very, very, technical individuals, some of the smartest and the brightest. We can come up with our own policies and approaches. But what we thought about in our governance team was also the way of how can we bring users into this discussion to come up with the values and some of the frameworks that we might be overlooking simply because we have our vested interests. So I'm just curious what you guys are thinking about that.
So on the Microsoft front, 2 things is, as we redesign our life cycle and development, one of the tools we gave to our people is HAX, which is a human-centered design software to help them think about, as they build those AI systems, how do they put the humans at the center. The second thing we're doing as well is, even though we're testing everything, I explained the tools we have, we actually run everything we do through our own teams. We have groups that we study. And we usually will take the most friendly and the most difficult, because we find that people are really anti, and we have groups who are against something. They give us amazing insights as to the biases we may have or the things we haven't thought through. And so it's one thing to go through your life cycle, but we don't even release product until we've done that internally with groups. And we really try to create that tension where we have the friendlies and the non-friendlies. And then we have another round where we adapt the product before we even release it. And then, of course, with our customers, we always have a first ring where we do it with a few customers, like we did with Copilot. We had about 1,000 customers in the world. We learned a lot from them, and then we adapted. In the next version, we said, OK, here are the things. And I think core principle to your point is, we tell everybody nobody's replacing humans. It's about complementing humans. And that's a core principle as well about what we do. Because if you get confused in your design process and thinking you're replacing a human, you're going to go really in the wrong direction. So that's a core principle as well. Hope this helps.
So, I mean, OpenAI's one of our core philosophies is iterative deployment, because we really think this is the way that people can adapt to these tools, and we can then take that back into every part of the design, development, deployment of the models. And so before we release a model, we spent 8 months, for example, with GPT-4, just testing it, red teaming it, understanding how people will use it, trying to predict how people will use it, and then feeding that back into the process, into the model, so that when it was deployed, it was going to behave as, it was going to be as safe as possible. But we still learn things every day. Similar to, the way you approach it, we deployed it to a small number of people first, and then we gradually opened it up. But we still, learn and incorporate things every single day. I mean, I think we actually are shipping a new model maybe every couple of weeks that incorporates those learnings.
I think ChatGPT has done a great service in that it's made this technology accessible to everybody, and so they can start to understand what it can and cannot do. Whereas before, if we said, hey, we're going to implement AI in your organization, people have no idea. So this has actually helped with the education of seeing what is possible for AI. So it's both an opportunity for you, because your employees can come up with ideas, but it also helps us in terms of when you're talking to users, what's possible. So user-centered design, though, I would claim is just the first bar. Yeah. You need to move beyond that to thinking about the larger community. So we've developed a workshop format where you can have people who are not technical experts actually debate and try to figure out what are the value tensions that are involved in the technology that you're thinking of deploying. And you will find that these values might be very different from the people in your organization and what they think about. So for example, we recently did a workshop with older adults in San Francisco, half of them coming from underrepresented marginalized communities, whether they were LGBTQ or underrepresented ethnicities. And you got at different values about this technology, especially about surveillance and communities that have been abused in the past by, let's say, medical research, and what are the issues. And you have to have some of these new techniques and tools to really get at these issues and think about the ways that you can still design around it and have people successfully deploy the technology. So we have to actually, I think, move beyond just user-centered design to these kind of broader ways of analysis.
Yeah, I will add to that. I will answer this question from a slightly different angle. Okay, so maybe part of sharing our Accenture's belief. I think that bringing user into this whole process is absolutely critical. I think last week at CES there was this friendly debate about all these AI agents running out, running around. Are they actually assisted agent? Are they actually autonomous agent? I think they could be both, and we actually believe that they are also augmented agent. So like 300 applications that we have built within Accenture for our employees, from sales to marketing to HR, we're using this basically the human plus machine kind of approach, and simply because we also believe, at least that's my personal belief, I don't know how many of you have heard of this famous behavioral economist, Daniel Kahneman, right? So system 1, system 2 kind of theories. There's also this big debate out there where AI actually make students dumber in the education system. In fact, it's not. It actually will foster critical thinking skills, encouraging humans to ask right questions, questioning everything. I think having this system 1, system 2 kind of working together, meaning AI can actually be playing a very big role, intuition-based, repetition-based kind of actioning, activating your system 1 thinking, but then humans can actually be more focusing on reasoning, logical thinking, higher level thinking, being more empathetical. So something that I think we're kind of infusing this kind of approach into everything we do. We're also taking this to clients.
I think this is great. I think I'm really glad you asked that question. This is a big topic. I had the opportunity of testifying at the U.S. Senate with Senator Schumer and Senator Young in the month of November, and the whole topic was exactly on this. It was about the fears that the workforce has, and as we bring more and more AI into the workforce, what is it that we need to do? And one of the things, and we had 40 senators and 10 of us testifying, and as we talked through the stories, it was very clear that AI is not well understood within the organization. And there are a lot of these anecdotal fears which we need to demystify. And the only way to do that is bringing the employees and the workers early on in the journey. So I just wanted to share that there is a big discussion going on in the US on that. There is also a big initiative going on with NIST, especially who are from the United States, in terms of the AI risk management framework. And right now, I'm personally working with Meta Open Loop in testing the whole NIST standards to make sure that it is more human-centric, so that it can drive better adoption, within our different industries. So if people here are interested to know more about that, I think these are great avenues for the industry to participate and provide feedback, so that it's a living thing. It's not like once done and done, right? It continuously has to evolve. So I'm cognizant of the time, and I really appreciate the discussion, and I want to just thank all of you for being here and being part of this. This is a dialogue, it's going to continue, so feel free to share your feedback if you want to learn from each other. And I want to really thank our panelists here, for your passion, for your leadership. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.